The town of Red Rock had seen its share of outlaws, drifters, and gunmen, but nothing ever stirred whispers like the giant in the cage. He sat there day after day, behind thick iron bars in the middle of the dusty square. His name was Eli, though most folks never bothered to call him that. To them, he was just the monster. Children were dragged past him by their mothers, eyes wide with fear. Men spat in the dirt near his feet, pretending they weren't afraid, though their hands always twitched near their gun belts. No one knew where he came from, only that he was taller, broader, and stronger than any man alive. And yet, he never fought back. He never spoke. He just sat there, silent as stone, with eyes that carried a sadness deeper than the desert night. But one evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, a lone rider came into town. A cowboy with a dust-worn hat, a steady gaze, and a way of carrying himself that made folks step aside without a word. His name was Jackson, and when his eyes fell on the giant in the cage, he didn't see a monster. He saw something else entirely. The saloon doors creaked as Jackson stepped inside, but his eyes weren't on the whiskey bottles or the card tables. They were fixed on the square outside, where the giant sat in silence. The townsfolk noticed. They always noticed. "Best keep riding, stranger," muttered a man at the bar, his voice low but sharp. "That thing out there ain't worth your trouble." Jackson didn't answer. He just tipped his hat, ordered a coffee instead of whiskey, and sat by the window where he could watch Eli. The giant's shoulders were slumped, his wrists bound in iron cuffs thicker than a man's wrist. Every so often, children would creep close, daring each other to throw a stone at him. Eli never flinched. He just stared at the ground, as if the weight of the world pressed heavier than the chains. By nightfall, the square emptied. Lanterns flickered, and the desert wind carried the smell of dust and horses. That's when Jackson finally rose, pushed through the saloon doors, and walked straight toward the cage. Bootsteps echoed on the wooden planks. Eli lifted his head for the first time in hours. His eyes, gray, stormy, and tired, met Jackson's. "You got a name?" Jackson asked, his voice calm, steady. For a long moment, silence hung between them. Then in a voice rough as gravel, the giant spoke a single word. "Eli." It was the first time anyone in town had heard him speak. From the shadows of the boardwalk, whispers rose. Folks leaned out of doorways watching, fear mixed with curiosity. Why was this cowboy talking to the monster? Didn't he know the stories? That Eli had crushed men with his bare hands? That he was too dangerous to roam free? But Jackson didn't move away. He leaned closer, his tone quiet, almost respectful. "Don't look like a monster to me. Looks like a man who's been caged too long." Eli's eyes narrowed, searching the cowboy's face for mockery. But there was none, only truth. And in that moment, something shifted. For the first time in years, Eli felt seen. By morning, the whole town was buzzing. Word spread fast in Red Rock, faster than wildfire and dry brush. The giant spoke, and the cowboy listened. At the general store, women whispered behind flour sacks. At the blacksmith's, men argued over whether Jackson was brave or just plain foolish. By noon, the sheriff himself came striding across the square, his spurs jangling like warning bells. Sheriff Colton was a hard man, the kind who believed order came from fear, not fairness. He stopped in front of the cage, glaring at Eli, then turned his eyes on Jackson. "You got business here, stranger?" he asked, his voice sharp as a whip. Jackson didn't flinch. He leaned against the post, arms crossed, calm as a man watching clouds roll by. "Just talking," he said. "Didn't know that was against the law." The sheriff's jaw tightened. "That thing ain't a man. He's dangerous. Killed 2 ranch hands with his bare hands. You'd do well to keep your distance." Eli's head lifted at those words, his eyes flashing with something between pain and anger. His voice rumbled low, but steady. "I never killed no one who didn't try to kill me first." The crowd gasped. It was the most anyone had ever heard him say. Mothers pulled their children back. Men's hands twitched toward their pistols. But Jackson only nodded, as if Eli's words confirmed what he already suspected. "Funny thing," Jackson said, his voice carrying across the square. "Folks'll believe any story if it keeps their fear alive. But I don't see a killer. I see a man who's been chained up so long, he's forgotten what freedom feels like." The sheriff stepped closer, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. "Careful, cowboy. You keep talking like that, and folks'll start thinking you're on his side." Jackson's eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his hat. "Maybe I am." The square went silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. For the first time, someone had spoken aloud what no one dared, that the giant in the cage might not be a monster at all. And in that silence, a seed of doubt was planted in the hearts of the townsfolk. The days that followed were restless ones in Red Rock. The town had always lived in uneasy peace with the giant in the cage. But Jackson's words had unsettled that balance. Fear was no longer enough to keep people quiet. Now there were questions, and questions, in a place like Red Rock, were dangerous. At the saloon, men argued over whiskey. "Sheriff's right," one growled. "That beast'll tear us apart if he's let loose." Another slammed his glass down. "Then why's he still sitting there, quiet as a church pew? If he wanted blood, he'd have taken it long ago." The blacksmith, a broad man with soot-stained hands, muttered, "I seen killers. Eli ain't one. He's broken, not bloodthirsty." But for every voice of doubt, there were 2 of fear. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Shopkeepers locked their doors earlier. And through it all, Eli remained in his cage, silent, watching the town tear itself apart over his existence. Jackson, meanwhile, didn't back down. Each evening, he walked to the square and spoke with Eli. Sometimes they exchanged only a few words. Sometimes Jackson told stories about the open plains, about wild horses running free, about rivers that cut through canyons older than time. Eli listened, his massive hands gripping the bars, his eyes softening with each tale. One night, as the moon hung pale and cold above the desert, Eli finally spoke more than a sentence. "They chained me," he said, voice low, "because I was different, because I was stronger. A rancher wanted me to work his land. I refused, said I wasn't his mule. He called me dangerous. Sheriff believed him, and here I've been ever since." Jackson studied him, the firelight from a nearby lantern flickering across his weathered face. "Truth has a way of being buried under fear," he said, "but chains don't last forever." From the shadows, a figure stirred. Sheriff Colton had been listening. His boots scraped against the dirt as he stepped into the light. "You think you're some kind of savior, cowboy?" he sneered. "This town don't need saving. It needs order, and order means that giant stays right where he is." Jackson's hand hovered near his holster, not in threat, but in readiness. His voice was calm, but it carried steel. "Order built on lies ain't order. It's tyranny." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "Careful. You're new here. Folks don't take kindly to strangers stirring up trouble." But Jackson didn't waver. He turned back to Eli, speaking loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. One day soon, you're going to walk out of this cage. And when you do, the world's going to see you for what you are. Not a monster, but a man. The townsfolk gasped. Some looked horrified, others uncertain. The sheriff's hand twitched on his revolver, but he didn't draw. Not yet. That night, as Jackson walked away, whispers followed him through the streets. Some called him reckless, others called him brave. But one thing was certain, the town of Red Rock would never be the same again. And Eli, for the first time in years, felt the faintest spark of hope. The sheriff didn't sleep much after that night. Jackson's words had struck him harder than a bullet, not because he believed them, but because he feared what they might do to the town. Fear was his weapon, his way of keeping Red Rock under his thumb. And if the people stopped fearing Eli, they might start questioning him. So Sheriff Colton began to whisper. He leaned on the saloon owner first, warning him that Jackson was stirring rebellion. He told the blacksmith that the cowboy was planning to unleash the giant on the town. He even visited the church, telling the preacher that Jackson was a dangerous drifter who'd bring ruin if he wasn't stopped. By the end of the week, the town was split clean in two. Some folks muttered that Jackson was a fool, a troublemaker who'd get them all killed. Others, quieter but growing bolder, began to wonder if maybe the cowboy was right. Maybe Eli wasn't the monster they'd been told he was. Meanwhile, Jackson kept visiting the cage. Each day he brought Eli something small, a piece of jerky, a tin cup of water, once even a harmonica. Eli didn't know how to play, but he held it like it was the first gift he'd been given in years. "You ever think about what you'd do if you were free?" Jackson asked one evening, leaning against the bars. Eli's massive hands tightened around the iron. His voice was low, almost ashamed. "Don't know if I'd remember how. Been in chains so long, I forgot what it feels like to walk without 'em." Jackson studied him for a long moment, then said, "You'd remember. A man don't forget freedom. He just buries it till someone digs it back up." Those words lit something in Eli's eyes. A flicker, a spark. But sparks are dangerous in dry country. That same night, Sheriff Colton gathered a group of men in the back of the saloon. Their faces were hard, their voices hushed. "This cowboy's poison," the sheriff said, slamming his fist on the table. "He's making folks doubt the law, doubt me. If he keeps on, he'll turn this town upside down. We can't let that happen." One man shifted uneasily. "What are you saying, Sheriff?" Colton's eyes narrowed. "I'm saying we put an end to it, quietly, before he gets the chance to do something we'll all regret." The men exchanged glances. Some nodded, some hesitated. But in the end, fear won out. Fear of Eli, fear of change, fear of losing the order they'd always known. And so, as the desert night stretched long and silent, a plan was set in motion. The next time Jackson came to the cage, he'd find more than just whispers waiting for him. The desert night was still, the kind of silence that makes a man's skin prickle. The moon hung low, pale as bone, casting long shadows across Red Rock. Eli sat in his cage, his massive frame hunched, eyes half closed as if he were carved from stone. But inside his chest was tight. He could feel it. Something was coming. Jackson felt it too. He had spent the evening sharpening his knife by lantern light, his revolver resting on the table beside him. He wasn't a man who looked for trouble, but he knew the sheriff wasn't the kind to let things lie. Fearful men never were, and sure enough, just past midnight, the sound came. Boots crunching on gravel, hushed voices, the metallic clink of rifles being readied. From the shadows of the alley, Jackson watched as half a dozen men crept toward the square. Their faces were hard, their eyes mean, but their steps were uncertain. They carried torches, and in their hands gleamed chains thicker than the ones Eli already wore. The sheriff led them, his jaw set like stone. "Tonight we end this," he hissed. "We drag that beast out to the canyon and bury him where no one will ever find him. And if the cowboy gets in the way, he goes down with him." The men nodded, though unease flickered in their eyes. Jackson's hand tightened on his revolver. He could have drawn right then, could have fired a warning shot into the air. But he knew that would only spark bloodshed. Instead, he stepped out of the shadows, his boots striking the dirt with deliberate weight. "Funny thing about snakes," he said, his voice carrying across the square. "They always slither out at night." The men froze. The sheriff's head snapped toward him, eyes narrowing. "You should have kept riding, cowboy," Colton growled. Jackson's revolver was in his hand now, steady as a rock. "And leave a man to be murdered in chains? That ain't my way." Eli stirred inside the cage, his eyes blazing as he realized what was happening. His massive hands gripped the bars, the iron groaning under his strength. For the first time, he roared, a sound so deep it shook the boards of the saloon and sent the horses in the stable rearing. The townsfolk, roused from their sleep, began to gather at windows and doorways. They saw the sheriff and his men with chains and torches. They saw Jackson standing alone, gun drawn between them and the giant. And they began to whisper, "Why would the sheriff kill him in the night? Why not face him in daylight if he's so dangerous? Maybe the cowboy's right. Maybe Eli ain't the monster after all." The sheriff saw the doubt spreading like wildfire, and rage twisted his face. He yanked his revolver free, pointing it at Jackson. "You're finished here, cowboy." But before he could fire, Eli did something no one expected. With a roar that split the night, he wrenched at the bars of his cage. Iron screamed, bolts tore loose, and with one final heave, the door burst open. Chains clattered to the ground. The giant was free. The sheriff stumbled back, his torch falling to the dirt. His men froze, torn between fear of Eli and fear of the crowd now watching with wide, questioning eyes. Jackson didn't move. He didn't raise his gun at Eli. Instead, he lowered it, his voice steady. "Eli, come with me." The giant's chest heaved, his eyes locked on the cowboy. For the first time in years, he wasn't looking at the ground. He was looking at freedom, and the town of Red Rock held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The square was silent, every eye fixed on Eli as he stepped out of the shattered cage. Chains fell from his wrists like dead snakes, and for the first time in years, he stood tall beneath the open sky. Sheriff Colton raised his gun, but his hand shook. The crowd wasn't with him anymore. They saw the truth now, the sheriff's fear, his lies, his need for control. A murmur rose, then a shout. "Put it down, Colton!" The sheriff's face twisted, but he knew it was over. Slowly, he lowered his weapon. Jackson stepped forward, his voice steady, carrying across the square. "This man ain't your monster. He's your neighbor, and no cage, no chain, no lie can change that." Eli looked at Jackson, his eyes wet with something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Jackson tipped his hat and spoke the words that sealed it all. "Come with me," and Eli did. As dawn broke over Red Rock, the cowboy and the giant walked side by side out of town, leaving behind the cage, the fear, and the sheriff's broken power. The people watched them go, knowing they'd witnessed something rare in the West. Not just strength, but courage, the kind that frees more than one man. And in the hush of that morning, Red Rock was never the same again.